Good evening. I have to begin with a confession. I'm not really an academic. I do have a PhD. And I have been a college professor for almost 10 years. But in my heart, I'm an artist, a storyteller, to be exact. Now, my scholarly training, it has come in handy over the years, I have to say, especially for almost nearly, close to a decade, when I tried and largely failed to get published. Now, my first picture book was published in 2008, and I had started writing for kids in 2000, and as you can see, I won quite a few awards for my first book. So I thought, now I've arrived. I'll have no problem placing my 20 other manuscripts. But that didn't happen. And the book I really wanted to publish was A Wish After Midnight. It's a time travel story set in Brooklyn. 15-year-old girl sneaks into the Botanic Garden late at night. She makes a wish in the fountain and gets sent back in time to 1863. It's the middle of the Civil War. Brooklyn is its own city. Weeksville is a thriving black community. President Lincoln has just issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and New York City is about to face the draft riots. Does that sound like a book you might want to read? Yes. Okay, well, I couldn't find an editor who was interested. So I started to wonder, what exactly is the problem? Am I just a bad writer? Do I have a bad attitude? Or is something else going on? Now, in the United States today, the majority of school-age children are kids of color. But the books being published don't reflect that reality. Now, the Cooperative Children's Book Center compiles statistics, and Tina Kugler has done a fantastic job of illustrating the statistics from 2012. Of the 3,600 books reviewed by the CCBC, 3% were about African Americans, 1.5% were about Latinos, less than 1% about Native Americans, and 2% were about Asian Pacific Americans, which means over 90% of the books that were published were about white children. Now, if we were to consider books by people of color, the numbers are even worse. On average, every year, only 2% of published children's book authors in the U.S. are African American. Now, why would there be such a disparity between the country's demographics and the books published for kids? Well, Publishers Weekly did a survey, and they found that 1% of publishing professionals self-identify as African American. So that probably has something to do with it. So, what I'm going to talk to you today about is race in children's literature and what I consider the symbolic annihilation of black youth. But I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about myself and how I went from writing a dissertation about lynching to writing fantasy fiction for kids. Seems a little odd, right? So, the first thing you need to know about me is I'm an immigrant. I've lived in this country for over 20 years. But you may have detected my accent. I spent the first 20 years of my life in Canada. I lived outside of Toronto, and from a very early age, I was in love with books. Now, that's probably because both of my parents are school teachers. My father, however, hated fiction, because when he was a boy in the Caribbean, his grandmother used to make him sit inside and read Alice in Wonderland, which he loathed. My mother, however, was an avid reader, and when she wasn't reading to me, my big sister was. My mother was also my kindergarten teacher, and she introduced me to the books of Ezra Jack Keats. I'm sure everyone in here has read a book by Ezra Jack Keats. He was a white Jewish man from Brooklyn, and 50 years ago, he was one of the very first people to include black children in books. When I read his books, what a thrill. Brown-skinned kids with afros, wearing bell-bottoms and ponchos. Because guess what I look like? Now, Rudy Sims Bishop says, readers often seek their mirrors in books. And she goes on to say that a book can do three things. It can be a mirror, a window, and a sliding glass door. So the book that is a mirror shows the child her reflection. And the book that's a window allows her to glimpse into someone else's world. And when a book is a sliding glass door, the divide between the reader and the characters disappears. Now, children who don't have books that are mirrors, well, they suffer from diminished self-esteem. They can feel invisible and insignificant. Whereas children who see themselves over and over again in books can develop a distorted sense of self-importance, and they can have difficulty relating to people who are different from them. Now, my supply of books that were mirrors ran out when I started to read novels. I still love to read, but the books that I read were a window that showed me white children having wonderful adventures in England. And I tell you, I loved those books. But when I sat down to write my own magical stories, I wrote about a little white girl instead of a girl who looked like me. Now, I was fortunate that I did have one book that lit a spark inside of me. And that was Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred D. Taylor. Devoured that book when I was a kid, returned to it in high school and wrote an essay on it. And I'm pretty sure this book planted a seed that ultimately developed into that dissertation on lynching. Now, when I sit down to write, as a Black feminist, I ask myself, what do the kids in my community need most? I think the publishing industry would answer, another biography of Martin Luther King. I'm not so sure. And really, I agree with Nancy Tolson, who says multicultural adolescent books found in most classrooms are historical fiction, realistic fiction, or nonfiction, reserving the luxury of fantasy for young white characters. Children of color have the right to read stories that offer an image of themselves soaring into magical adventures and fantastic worlds, but instead they have to accept the adventures of white children. I don't think fantasy fiction should be a luxury reserved for any one group of kids. In fact, I think magical stories matter most to kids who are misrepresented, maligned, and marginalized. I have to say, sometimes it feels in this country that Black youth are being singled out for extermination. The list of names is getting longer and longer. Trayvon, Michael, Rainisha, Ayana, Tamar, Ramarley, Jordan, Island. And when I look for the stories about the shortened lives and tragic deaths of those young people, there's an empty space on the shelf where those books should be. The erasure of Black youth from children's literature is a form of symbolic annihilation. It's just another way of saying to Black youth, your lives simply don't matter. So last summer, I had a really hard time writing. And I found myself wondering who was going to write a story for the children of Eric Garner, whose videotaped death horrified the nation. And I thought, what kind of book do those kids need? Do they need another biography of Martin Luther King? Maybe that would be a blueprint on how to overcome adversity. Or do they need a book that's full of magic? A book that would make them believe they had the power to change the world. Maybe one book can do both. I have worked with urban kids for 25 years. And when I go into a classroom, I remind those children that everyone has a story to tell. And I remind them that magic can happen to anyone, anywhere. But when you mention magic to kids in the US, they immediately conjure images of wands and wizards, Dungeons and Dragons, vampires and werewolves. Now, Celestine Wu, argues that it's not enough just to add kids of color to European fairy tales. She also acknowledges that for some of us, it's hard to relate to the folklore of our ancestors, and that's true for the children of Chinese immigrants, and it's true for the descendants of enslaved Africans. What's needed, Wu says, a people displaced from its homeland necessarily establishes a different relationship with its mythology, and the mythology must change to accommodate and incorporate the displacement. So what's needed is a mythology of displacement. And what I write is what I like to call Afro-urban magic. I'm not just trying to replace a white child with a black child in my books. I'm trying to write culturally specific narratives that draw on the magical practices of people of the African diaspora, because those stories can excite and empower young readers and educate them about the uses of power in their own rich culture. Fantasy fiction is not a luxury. It is a necessity. Ramon Saldivar says a new generation of authors can, quote, reverse the usual course of fantasy, turning it away from daydream, delusion, and denial in order to redeem or perhaps even create a new moral and social order. Saldivar argues that we need a new form, and he calls this form historical fantasy. It's the kind of magic that recognizes and responds to injustice, and that is the kind of magic that Black youth need today, because this has got to change. Children of color deserve a range of stories that reflect their histories, their contemporary realities, and the infinite possibilities of the future. But can we rely on the publishing industry to fix this? I don't think so. So what are our alternatives? Well, I believe in a community-based publishing model. I'm calling it Publishing for the People, where we use print-on-demand technology to allow the people to decide which stories matter most to them. So I, last year, self-published 9 books. I'm going to self-publish 4 more this year. That still leaves me with 15 manuscripts. But I figure, why am I wasting my time sending stories to gatekeepers who are not from my community and who don't appreciate or maybe even understand my culture? Last fall, I collaborated with Maya Cristina Gonzalez. She's an artist and illustrator. We wanted to have authors and artists responding to Ferguson. We developed this site. I hope you'll check it out, Kid Lit Equality. Maya designed these beautiful posters. I think there are about a dozen altogether, which you can download for free. Who in here is ready to write their own story? Because everybody has a story to tell. Excellent young man right over here. All right, I'm going to assume that some of you are closet writers. If you're thinking you might want to write stories for kids, I definitely recommend that you check out Maya's course, The Heart of It. She has other courses as well. She's very interested in working with people who want to tell stories to kids in their authentic cultural voice. If you are not ready to write your own story, but you still want to support authors of color, I hope you'll take the birthday party pledge. It means for 1 year, you will only give as gifts books by and about people of color. We have dozens of recommendations on this site, and we have to feed the imagination of our children. We have to if we're going to keep calling ourselves a nation of dreamers. Every time a child picks up a gun, that's a failure of imagination. And every time a cop looks at a Black youth and sees a demon, that's a failure of imagination too. So if we really are going to try to create a new moral and social order, we're really going to have to study our history. And we're probably going to need a little bit of magic too. Thank you.